Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Spring Two Rivers Reading Series event featuring Gretchen Marquette and her brand new poetry book, Mayday. We're really happy to have you here today for this great event. I'm going to give a couple of announcements just before we get started. Please take a moment to silence your electronics. That'd be great. I also want to let you know that our fall event, we've selected our book. It is A Good Time for the Truth, edited by Sun Young Shin. That event will be on Wednesday, November 1st from 12 to 12:50 and 2 to 2:50, also in the Legacy Room. I want to thank the members of the Two Rivers Reading Series Committee, co-chair Chris McCarthy, member Jennifer Wilcott, and Melody Heidi for helping organize this event today. Thanks to all the English Division faculty and the reading faculty who adopted this book in their courses. We're happy that you have read it, and a lot of you have written about it, and you're ready to hear the author today. I also want to thank the sponsors of today's event, the English Division, Veterans Affairs, and Faculty Development. If you are interested in creative writing, as you go out the door later today, on the left-hand side we have a table set up with brochures and information about our creative writing classes here at Anoka Ramsey. And also on the right-hand side, we have a table set up by Veterans Affairs. So you can stop by there and get brochures and other information from them as well. I do want to let you know about a creative writing information session we're having on Monday, April 3rd in the Riverview Room at 2 p.m. This is open to students. We will be providing some treats, cookies and bars and lemonade. And if you have any interest in creative writing classes, this is your chance to talk to the faculty and find out about our AFA. Today, Marquette will read some of her poems, we'll talk about Mayday, and we'll take questions from our audience. If you would like your book signed afterwards, she's going to be sitting at this table in the middle, and I'll have you start a line and kind of run toward the window after she's finished reading. If you'd like to purchase extra copies of Mayday, the bookstore has copies for sale as well. One last item, and then we'll get going. If you're looking for an attendance certificate, at the end of this session, you will see English faculty positioned at all of the doors, and they will have a certificate to give to you when we're finished. Okay, we are thrilled today to have with us Gretchen Marquette, author of Mayday, published by Grey Wolf Press in 2016. Mayday was recently named a poetry finalist for the 29th Annual Minnesota Book Awards, which is only a little more than a week away, so we're happy to have her at this exciting time, and we're wishing her the best of luck in winning that award. Publishers Weekly listed Mayday as a top 10 summer read, and Marquette's poems have appeared in well-respected publications such as Harper's, Poetry Magazine, Tin House, and the Paris Review. She is a 2014 recipient of an Emerging Writers Grant from the Loft Literary Center. Mayday is an intense exploration of love and loss, a skillful examination of the complexities of relationships where love and absence coexist. The speaker fears for her brother serving in Iraq, grieves a failing relationship, and identifies with the vulnerability of the natural world. The images in this book linger with the reader. The injured deer, thirsty and broken in the wet grass. The cup of a skull, emptying of light and filling hourglass slow with clay. The woman's sunglasses in the cup holder that the lover hasn't bothered to remove. The poems are layered and raise questions not easily answered. In the poem Doe, for example, the speaker exits the poem by asking, why are so many love stories tragedies? Please welcome Gretchen Marquette.
Hey everybody. Am I too loud or loud enough? Yeah, good, okay. I just wanted to say thank you again to the English Division and Veterans Affairs, as well as Faculty Development, for hosting this event, and thanks to so many of you for reading my book in your class. I know it was probably required, but I like that you connected with it enough that you took time out of your day to come and hear me read. So most of you who've read the book know that there are a couple of big themes in the book, and one of them is that lost love, and one of them is sort of the natural world, and then the third big theme is the deployment of my brother. He's my younger brother, so I feel quite protective of him, and he deployed first to Iraq and then to Afghanistan within a really short amount of time. And while he was gone, I wrote a lot of poems about him and for him, and so I thought today, since we have just about 20 minutes for me to read to you, that I would read most of the poems that are about my brother. But I am going to start with the first poem in the book, and I'm also going to read the last poem in the book. But in the middle, there'll be the poems about my brother Greg. Also, if you happen to have questions, like in the middle, like after I read a poem, you can feel free to raise your hand and ask before the end of the reading too. So this is the first poem in the book, and it's called Elsewhere. I've kept it quiet, where to find the brightest, most exacting love. Much of it burns off. What remains, remains. Fox wild, desire is a trap. I recognize places I've slept despite every branch broken and the new snow. What I said before about love, you have to let it be. I've never told how I walk around thinking of the hollow of a throat or curve of a shoulder, or how I hold the reins of horses who are men in hiding. We sat under hot light in a round room plush with the breath of strangers. I said, we have 70 pages left to love one another. Across his chest burst a sash of gold chrysanthemum. One thing I've learned, you have to let love be practice for what might happen elsewhere. So this poem is called Gregory, because that's my brother's name. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold. He went to school at West Point, and so I wrote this poem when I went there to see him graduate. Gregory. Traveling those dark roads to see him, twisting through carved forests, the eyes of animals appeared jewel-bright in the sweep of my headlights. He didn't want to pose for pictures, hot in his dress gray over whites, the coat with the bullet buttons, all of us sweating as we pointed out statues he'd strode by thousands of times. I kept mistaking another girl's brother for him, marching in formation, soft haircuts under plumes of black feathers. He was already less ours. Later, in blue jeans, he skipped rocks on the Hudson, the river swallowing the sun in a rush, boats scattering across the long arm of the water, tiny lights I would remember when I fastened a bracelet to my wrist, spectrum of stones he gave me for Christmas when he was 12. He did work in the concession stand at the swimming pool the summer he was 12, and then used the money to buy my sister and I Christmas presents. That's the kind of person he is, and that's why it was so hard to think of him being gone. This poem is called Trophy. Up north, deer are eyelights among pines, green lanterns of Tapita lucida, ghosts licking the salty periphery of dreams. They're tabletop figurines, thin running legs cracked and mended, line of glossy residue, glue made of bone. Watching figures stalk the fields, small flames threatening to touch off the chaff, my brother vowed to build a barn to hide deer during hunting season, an old story we tell to watch him flush. He'd seen trophies in the basements of men, black noses giving a wet illusion. On highways, the inside out of a deer, viscera slick, shocking as a stranger's nude body. Yesterday, he said soldiers in Iraq call tattoos meat tags, hard glint in his eyes. So while my brother was gone the first time, I was still in graduate school, and I started to be sort of superstitious about a lot of things, and one of the things I was superstitious about was that if I wrote about my brother, then something bad would happen to him. And so I wasn't really writing at all, because all I really wanted to write was about what I was worried about with my brother. But I was in graduate school, and that wasn't really an option. I didn't want to show up to school with nothing done. And so I was trying to write these poems that talked about what happened to Hansel and Gretel after the story ended, and I was struggling with that. And my teacher pointed out to me that maybe the reason I was so obsessed with Gretel was because she was able to keep her brother safe when he was in a really dangerous situation, and that hadn't occurred to me. And so I went home and I wrote this poem. It's called Dear Gretel, and it's a poem sort of asking her about how she kept her brother safe. Dear Gretel, did you spend the night curled close to his cage, near enough that you smelled the straw of his bedding? Did you lie there and listen to him exhale? Did he talk in his sleep, a sound loud, nonsensical, its echo disappearing into dark like a rock tossed down a well? How did you keep him safe? Was it merely proximity? Say the danger is too large to fit in an oven. What would you do? Dear Gretel, was it your idea to give the witch something to pinch? The chicken bone, I mean. Did it haunt you how akin it was to his little finger? Dear Gretel, they say you stole her glasses, ground their lenses to dust, to flour. Is that a hint? What's to steal when Hazard has excellent sight? Dear Gretel, did you ever consider the moment his face could disappear behind flames? Did you wonder if it would be a clear day, a Wednesday, laundry day, that without him you would no longer be a sister, just a girl with an ashy apron? Gretel, when the stones in the pit were cold, the witch out collecting herbs or busy snoozing, did you fill these lulls with distraction? Did it help to give him things, chocolate, gummy bears, magazines to read? If he asked for sheets with a higher thread count or for grass to plant because he was lonely with all that dry straw, did that finally break your heart? Gretel, how did it feel later to walk in the woods with him, a witch's smoldering bones just color in the sky? Was it relief you breathed, or did you keep your fear? Introduce it to thin ice, unstable rock, opaque water? Did you always wince afterward, watching him dive? Did you let it go on too long? Those of you who have had family members who are deployed or have had family members or siblings in other dangerous situations for other reasons, you know that even when the danger is past, sometimes it's hard to let go of it. You know, you still kind of hold on to that fear for them, and that's the ending of the poem. Sometimes people ask me, you know, did I let what go on too long? And between his deployments, when he came home, he and I went to a quarry where we like to swim, and he's a really good diver, but every time he would dive, I was really worried, and I didn't used to be, and I realized that maybe I would always be a little bit worried for him in a way that I hadn't before. That's just kind of how it works when someone you love has been through something. So this poem isn't exactly for my brother. It's actually written for the Spanish playwright Federico Garcia Lorca. He was is an important kind of poet for me. He was assassinated in the opening days of the Spanish Civil War, and he has some really beautiful plays and letters and poems and things, and so I wrote this poem about his death. It's called Lament with Red Wall and Olive Tree, after Lorca. It occurs to me the places where the bullets entered and escaped, and the cup of your skull emptying of light and filling hourglass slow with clay, your teeth in your mouth and nothing left to chew. Your last words written without the sway of your duende, its pied cloak swelling in the coil of wind raging from the place slashed between here and there, the figure born of watching bulls coughing froth. Ghastly, your last written words. Father, please give this man a donation of 1,000 pesetas for the army, a sum he swiftly paid, not knowing you were already gone. There are men in my family who have gone to war. They've killed other men who didn't want to die. This isn't about war, only grief. Oh, let us be birds together. Let us both be lilies. Let us eat the ineffable bliss of having stamens and pistils. I know a child who replaced his father with apples, carries green apples, and his mother swaps them when they soften and weep sugar, waits until he sleeps, then sets a glossy new fruit near his pillow. Why apples? Why green apples? I just have a couple more left, so maybe start thinking of your questions so that when I ask, you don't leave me hanging. I get really shy when people do that, so. So this is a poem called Boy. Last night the phone rang. My brother said, Afghanistan, December. He hadn't begun to tell us about Iraq yet. Let's not dwell on it, he said, meaning Afghanistan. My brother sent pictures last year from Iraq, mostly of himself petting stray dogs, though in one photo his eye looks bruised. I had to accept. A weapon moves through another country on the back of my brother, whose head is full of glum love songs. It wasn't just the heat, it was the aridity. I'm trying to plant some grass, he said, something green. We sent it across the ocean as seeds. It's so dry here, he said, I can't explain. As kids, we spent summers in lakes, in rivers, in pools. My brother was first to dive, no matter how cold the water. No one flinched if it took time for him to surface. We trusted his body's ascension, that before long we'd see his ecstatic face. So this poem is a short little poem, but it took me almost my whole life to write it. When my mom was a little girl, she grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and she told me a story about how when she was little, a deer had somehow found its way downtown and onto State Street, and it had jumped through the window of a boutique, and the police had to come and shoot this deer. And I just was haunted by that from the time I was really little. And I wanted to write about that deer because it stayed such a compelling figure in my brain, and I wasn't able to do that until I thought about my brother. So this poem is called Deer Through a Boutique Window. Some things can't be mended. Some of us are broken, and some remain whole. Something has died in every place on earth. But I can't stop thinking about hooves on waxed black diamonds of linoleum. Also thousands of deer unharmed in the woods bedding down, and fawns unborn to this doe, wrecked among silk stockings, satin slips, pearl earrings. How do we get lost in such a small world? Why are some of us lucky and some of us not? There she lies, scent of her own blood in her nose, the elegant pheromones in their frosted glass bottles, oblivious, unbroken on the shelf. So I'm going to read, just maybe for a little bit of brevity's sake, before I read the last poem in the book, I'm going to read this poem that I wrote. It's called Two Trains, and I wrote it, I challenged a friend of mine to write a poem based on a math problem, and he didn't understand what I meant. And so I was like, well, just give me a second and I'll try to explain. And so I started to write this poem just really quickly as an example, but it like turned out like miraculously. It was like a kind of gift poem. So this poem is called Two Trains. Two trains leave different cities, heading toward each other at different speeds. When the man in train number 1 slides across the seat to kiss the woman who has been looking out the window, what texture is the upholstery of the seat on that train if the upholstery in train number 2 is a faded, tobacco-colored naugahyde? If the conductor of train number 2 had not had to milk the cows every morning and afternoon of his childhood, would he have had more time to stay after school peering in microscopes? In this case, who would then be commanding train number 2? If the conductor of train number 1 was able to express how much he loved to drive the train into the night, that he imagined it not along any track, just shoving into the dark, never arriving to bathe in the bright lights of Seattle, would they demote him to porter? If the porter in train number 1 was not pretending to be well when in fact he was sick, who would care for him? Which city? Which woman? The one with the salmon-colored geraniums, or the one whose stockings drip all night against the radiator? When the man in train number 2 drops his briefcase and it pops open, sending 7 small bottles to bounce soundlessly across the carpeted aisle, will the small girl who witnessed it remember the color of the bottles later? Will she think of them when she sees, for the first time, the sulfuric green water on her honeymoon in Yellowstone National Park? Who is her spouse? Which train have they boarded? When and where do they meet? So this is the last poem in the book. Often, if you've read my book, you can see that I have a lot of epigraphs or maybe other little pieces of texts from other books, and that's because I get inspired a lot by what I'm reading. And I happen to be reading a book that talked about this quotation by this writer named Leslie Paul, and I disagreed with what she had to say, and so I took the piece of her writing that I disagreed with, and I made that epigraph my poem, and then I wrote a response to it. So her epigraph, or her lines say, "All life will die, all mind will cease, and it will all be as if it never happened. That, to be honest, is the goal to which evolution is traveling. That is the benevolent end of the furious living and furious dying. All life is no more than a match struck in the dark and blown out again. The final result is to deprive it completely of meaning." So I thought, well, if that's true, then what will we love with the time we have left? First, the purple flowers growing along the sidewalk, so saturated with color they make us blind to look at them. Then the sound of a screen door slamming, the smell of pine pollen and beeswax. The silvery eyes of the concrete deer guarding a bird bath. The uncomfortable feel of wet jeans stiff with sand. The taste of well water from an aluminum cup. The sound of water being poured into a glass. Hot tea with 1 ice cube in it. The silk of frog skin and the stinging nettle. Smell of wet rock, scent of aftershave on steam. Squeak of finger against the mirror. The day-old cookies in their white paper bag brought home to surprise the dogs. The lamb's wool weigh an old dog's legs feel, her body failing her. The way the child sings a song she was taught about loneliness before being taught about loneliness. Throats, armpits, arches of feet, perfunctory head nods of strangers walking the opposite direction. The smoke pulled in soft through the open window along with the wind through wet hair. The twin images of neurons and cluster galaxies. The cold calm of a museum exhibit, maces and daggers backlit and serene. The way Bernini made marble supple, the way Caravaggio's brutal hands painted white. All the furious living. The turtle dragging herself, algaed from the lake, to the sand at the top of the playground to lay her eggs. All the furious dying. The unidentifiable viscera that the wasps are drinking from on the sidewalk. The way the wasps relish it. The heron lifting off with the skyline behind her, berries crushed in mouths. the alabaster egg, the toy horse, the little brother at age 3 in his gray pajamas waving, the light and heat of the fairgrounds, the airy relief of the gondola in its primary colors, and the dank cool of the dark mill ride. The warm hand and the water lapping against the side of the boat, even the memory of them. The sulfur of a match struck, the dark it removes, and the way the dark comes back. Thank you. So we still have time, so if you have a question or you want me to talk about a certain poem or to read that poem, I can still do that for you too.
Yes, I was wondering if you could read translations for me.
Sure. Gretchen,
So,
if you could repeat the question.
Sure. So he just asked if I would read the poem Translation. And this poem actually was another poem that I wrote for that poet that I told you about, the one who lived in Spain. So Translation, after Lorca. It's been a long night. You keep finding a way to speak to me. I'm weary from the root of me, my bees breaking open, and the lust in the furious snap of the flag flown over the country of one woman. You translate cicada speech like something ratcheted, tuned, and in the morning, the scratch of a stick being dragged through sand. How often am I the one missing from conversations, however patient you are with me? You possess every word to set anguish like a bone, to fix it, every word awake. You've got all the words, though I go on fumbling. Let me learn another language.
For every poem that you write, how many didn't make it in the book?
That's a great question. He asked for every poem that made it into the book, how many did not make it into the book. I think I have a kind of a different experience than a lot of people do, where after I signed my contract, I still had time to be working on the book, and so most of the poems in the 5th section I wrote after I signed my contract. And that also means that there were many poems that were in the original manuscript that got pulled out. And actually, right towards the end of the process of editing the book, we decided that we wanted it to be even tighter. My editor and I decided we wanted it to be even tighter. So that was painful because I had to pull out maybe 10 more poems. And so at one point I decided that this book had a dark twin, and I was going to try to find all the poems that didn't make it and see if that made a different book. But I do think the strongest poems ultimately made it in here. But I would say that I probably have another maybe 40 pages of poems that did not make it into the book. Sure. So this poem, it happened pretty much just like it says in the poem itself. It's on page 26. I'll read it because it's really short. So I was actually talking with a friend, and she told me about this thing that I'll talk about in the poem. And I was already sort of aware that this person who I loved very much and who I knew loved me, that maybe we couldn't be together despite the fact that we loved each other. But there were also, I was angry with him sometimes, and I didn't always love him, but I knew I loved him. And so when I heard this fact, I thought of him, and that's why I wrote this poem, and it's called Fisherman. I read that fishermen lose fingers if rings catch in netting, and rarely do they wear wedding bands. You're the only man I know who could handle life on a fishing boat, so the hand I saw holding the net was yours. I don't always want to be your wife, can't make you dance in public, don't want to give up everyone I could love, but I confess that when I saw you, rain slick, red face and a rough sea behind you, my first thought was, how do I get him off that boat and home safe beside me? Do you have a question about it, or did they answer it? Okay. Yeah. Yep.
Would you talk about the poem Lost?
So I was actually given a list of questions that people had submitted to, so maybe some of you really shy people, I have your questions written down up here. But one of the questions, or a few of the questions, asked me about if it's scary to share some of this kind of personal information, right? And the answer is yes and no. So there's a poet named Linda Paston, and she says that the lyric I that you hear me saying in the poems, it's more of a fraternal than an identical twin, right? So it's me in these poems, but it's just not quite me in the poems. And the longer that goes by, the more I change away from the person who wrote these poems. And so in some ways it becomes easier over time to read these poems out loud, for example. But sometimes, like in the case of this poem that you're talking to me about, it's still very vulnerable material, right? So this poem was actually, it began as a much longer poem, maybe 30 lines long. And in the process of editing the book, my editor pointed out to me that, I do have this habit of burying things that are really tough for me within a poem. And so he challenged me to cut it down so that only the really important part of the poem remained, and that's what was left. And so I will read it, but it is the scariest poem for me in the whole book to read. Luckily, it's only like 4 lines long. But basically, the poem is about how this person and I were together for almost 7 years, and I thought that we would have a family. And then we separated, and I realized that we wouldn't. And that was really kind of shocking for me to realize for sure that that wouldn't happen. And so this poem is called Lost, and it's actually only 3 lines. Lost. Weeks after the last time she bled. It was startling. There would never be anyone made from the way he needed her. Quick, someone ask another question. It is my first book. So I've been in graduate school and I'd written a thesis. A lot of you some of you in creative writing classes that you write kind of portfolios. It's just like a really intense portfolio. And so I'd written a thesis. My friend referred to it as a bloated elk because it was like 140 pages long and it didn't really have a theme. Whereas you can kind of see these themes in Mayday, right? There's kind of an arc that happens. There's a beginning, middle, and an end. So I had the experience of writing a thesis, but this was my first actual book that I created for people to read.
Is there a connection between the last and the first poem?
Can you say more about that?
So like your first one talks more about endings, and your last one talks more about like beginnings in your life. Is there like a connection you have between them?
I think I like that you noticed that and that you pulled that out. I think it's a lot of work and a lot of fun for me personally. Some people don't like this part, but I like looking at all the poems and figuring out the order that they belong in. And so the last poem I wrote for this book was actually Mule Trail, which is not the last poem in the book, obviously. But when I was looking at which poems to begin and end on, those ones just kind of seemed right. But I think sometimes when you're really tracking in good territory as a writer, you make the right decisions without knowing why you made them. And I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head that this book isn't really about everything ending. It's more about something ended which created a new beginning. And that's why the book is Mayday, 2 words, and not Mayday, 1 word, which is the distress call, like when a plane is going down, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. It's more like Mayday, like spring coming back.
In general, what kinds of things do you do to motivate yourself to write, or when you're writing ideas, what things do you do to go back?
He asked like how I stay motivated to write, and when I have ideas, like how I turn those into poems, essentially. So I have my writer's notebook with me right here. Like I never have it too far away from me. And that's kind of like my biggest tip because it's like an external hard drive for your brain. So if you're a really busy person like I am, sometimes you will think of a thought or an idea or a line, and if you write it down in here, you won't lose it. And so I use my notebook for a lot of things. I handwrite poems that I love from other people, jot down books that I want to read, but I also write down little things that I notice when I'm going about my day. And the more you practice noticing, the more you notice things. It's sort of like the same way that, a pianist will practice their scales, or a dancer gets up every day and practices. If you are a writer, you need to start practicing noticing and then actually putting it down so that you don't lose it. And so sometimes I go a long time without actually writing something that I've finished. That's a poem that I want to put out into the world, but I'm always thinking like a writer and trying to move through the world as a writer, and I'm always writing things down, even if they're not ready for an audience. Does that answer your question more or less?
Yes.
Do you feel like you have to get into a certain mindset or persona when you're writing?
No. There's a poet that says that, poetry is something that's done in a place of calm after something really awful has happened, or at a point of being riled up emotionally. But that's not how it works for me. I actually write during the emotional riledness. I feel like writing the poem is sort of what gets me from one side of that to the other. I don't really need to do it once I feel calm, but everybody's different. I think I don't write in persona very often because just personally for me it feels really tricky and sort of fraught to try to step into someone else's shoes. Mostly I just look for those things, like I was just mentioning with the student. Like I look for the things that sort of light up, like they are in my territory, and then I think about, why am I thinking about this in this particular way? So like an example is, I was walking down the street the other day, and there was this, somebody who had a laundry basket, and they were under the bus stop, and it had started to rain, but they had taken a towel out of the laundry basket and put it over their head, and then were like standing out in the rain, but the towel was keeping them dry. And when I walked past, I could smell like the fabric softener on the towel, because the towel was still warm, and they were being rained on. And something about all those sensory details just kind of mattered to me, and I didn't really know why. So I just wrote that down in my notebook, but now I've already been able to place that into a poem. And so I think it's not more about getting into a certain mindset, it's just about noticing enough that a poem starts to build itself in my brain. Any other questions about writing?
Who's your more favorite writer, both living and dead, and why?
That's a great question. So I guess I'll stick with Federico Garcia Lorca, since I've already talked with you about him a bit. He is just very, very imaginative and permission granting. Like he says there's poetic work that's done, right? And it's the work that your brain does all on its own. So he has a poem where he says he has 1,000 crystal tambourines that are wounding the dawn. And you don't have to know intellectually what that means to kind of know what that means, right? And so I go to his poems a lot to see that kind of imagery and that kind of risk-taking, I think is exciting. And then I think one of my favorite poets who's living right now, his name is Kaveh Akbar. It's K-A-V-E-H-A-K-B-A-R. He's a young poet. He lives in Florida, but he'll soon be teaching at Purdue. And he has a chapbook out called Portrait of the Alcoholic, but he has a full-length collection that's due out next year, and I just highly recommend checking his work out. He's really amazing, really amazingly gifted poet. And his first poem was published when he was 7, and it was about the Green Bay Packers, because he lived in Wisconsin at the time, so. So yeah, start writing about the Packers, and maybe someday you'll have a whole book written, not about the Packers. That's a great question. She asked if I still, now that I have a book, when I write poems, are they just for myself, or am I thinking about them in the context of another book? I wish I could kind of go back to that brain where I was just writing one poem at a time and just doing it because I wanted to, but it's hard to turn that part of your brain off when you're thinking about wanting to have a second book, because you're thinking about how it does fit. Maybe not when you're doing that first draft, but even when you're revising, I think about that more often. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but I do miss when I was a student and I had an idea for a poem and I would just sit down and see what would happen, and there was, I put pressure on myself in a different way back then, and I kind of miss that. Yeah.
You still writing poems about your brother?
Actually, I haven't really been. Most people come up after a reading and want to know if he's okay, and he is okay. He's back and he lives now in San Antonio. He's still in the military. And now that he's home, I feel less urgency about writing about him. But there's been some tricky stuff that's happened, so some people have assumed that he died based on reading the book. In some creative writing classes, you might have talked about the difference between the poet and the speaker, right? There's the person who wrote the book, and then there's the voice that is in the book. And in a couple different reviews, they said Gretchen Marquette's brother died in Iraq, and that did not happen. If they would have said the speaker in the poem's brother died in Iraq, that would have been different, because the speaker in the book, that was her worst fear, and it easily could have happened, and it happened to many other people. Many people lost their siblings. So that would have been fine, but they said Gretchen Marquette's brother died in Iraq. So I was very upset, and I had to call him and tell him that, like, in several newspapers he had died, and he took it much better than I did. He made a bunch of jokes about it. But he also said something that I thought was really astute. He said some people really can only understand loss through death, you know? And it goes back to what I was talking about, that my relationship to him has changed because I had to worry about him for so long. Like, I'd be walking around and I'd have like that bad feeling, and you know what that's like, and then you realize like you have a dentist appointment the next day, or you forgot to turn in an assignment, or it's just something you can resolve. But I would realize I was worried about my brother, and there was nothing I could do for months on end. And I think it's hard to stop that anxiety once you learn how to feel it. And so it's likely I'll write about him more in the future, but right now I'm not writing about him as much.
What was, if your brother read the book, and if he did, what was his reaction to like the poems you wrote about him, or did he already know you felt that way?
I think he sort of already knew that I felt that way. He's very generous about not telling me that he doesn't want me to write about him. Sometimes I feel like maybe he doesn't really want to, because he doesn't tell me as much as he tells my sister about what happened to him when he was gone. But he's been very supportive. It's really hard for him to get away because he's still in the military, and he managed to come up here from Texas when my book came out to hear me read, and came out and danced with us all night and had a good time. So my family in general has been really supportive of everything that I said in the book.
There was another hand. You made a lot of poems about him. Were they really about him or for him? And who was your main audience?
So that's a great question. She said, I wrote a lot of poems about my brother. So were they for him or were they about him? And who was the main sort of target, right, you said in the book? So I would say that mostly the poems are about him. Some of the poems are for Lorca, but predominantly when I'm talking to this you in the book, it's to that person who I used to be in love with. And that was hard because even after I finished writing the book, I'd be writing a poem and I realized I was writing to you, and I don't want to write to you anymore. You don't get to be you anymore. But that's kind of who the main audience is for this book. However, it's not, I didn't write it for him. You'll notice like his name is absolutely nowhere in this book. If I reference him, I just use an X there because it's not really for him. It's bigger than that, and hopefully it's the book that I wish I could have read when I had my heart broken, and that's what I want it to be for other people. So it's less personal than a letter to him.
Maybe one last question?
thinking of that new person that you used to be in love with, now that you're up and coming, you more known. Now hopefully you got some zeros in that bank account, and come back.
Well, first of all, I'll say a friend of mine said, you know, become a best-selling poet and literally make hundreds of dollars. So that's what I'll say first. But no, I think that ship has sailed. You know, we were young together, and I'll always kind of treasure that. But yeah, I don't know him anymore. So yeah, that ship has sailed. One last short question, and you can also come up when I'm signing books and ask if you don't get your question asked. But if someone wants to ask one last question,
How did you get signed?
how did I get my book?
Yeah, how did you get signed to your book?
So when I was I just graduated from school, but right before I graduated, a famous poet, his name was Ralph Angel, he came to talk to my graduating class. And he said that he thought everybody should submit a poem to their top journal, even if you felt stupid doing it, and see what happens. Because when he submitted his work, the very first thing he submitted was to the New Yorker, and he got it published. And we were all just like, we hate you, Ralph Angel. It's never going to happen. But I thought, you know, what's really the harm in it? So I submitted some work to the Paris Review. And then, like, maybe 6 or 8 months later, on like one of the worst days of my whole life, I had just finished teaching, and I went back to my office, and I had an email from the Paris Review, and I thought it was a rejection, but it wasn't. They were asking me if they could have one of my pieces, which was a really big deal. So that poem got published, and then the magazine Harper's, they picked it up and republished it, and because those two things happened, Jeff Schatz, who is the poetry editor at Grey Wolf, he reads really widely, and he had seen a lot of the other things I had published, maybe like in more local journals and things. And he saw that piece, and he looked at my bio, and it just said Gretchen Marquette lives in Minneapolis. And so he's like, who is this person? And so he tracked me down and asked me if I had a book that he could see. And I sort of did, and so I just took, you know, a month and a half and tried to put something together for him, and then it kind of took off from there. So really it was because I had published that work. So if you're just starting out, make sure you're getting your work out there, because it wasn't just that great Paris Review publication he noticed. It was, he'd already seen my name before because I published in other journals. There's a world of amazing journals that people care about and put so much effort into that you'd be lucky to have your work in. There's enough to go around for everybody, so just send your work out when it's ready. Okay, I think that's it. I'm happy to sign your book, so come on up if you'd like. Thank you.